When the president of the Homeowners Association attempted to evict him, she had no inkling that she was about to step into her very own nightmare. Malik Patterson had long nurtured the dream of owning a home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. After years of relentless effort and determination, he finally achieved that goal. His new residence, a striking two-story brick home located in Brentwood Estates, Tennessee, rested on a meticulously maintained lot, complete with a wraparound porch and an expansive backyard. It was everything he had ever envisioned, peaceful, elegant, and the perfect sanctuary in which to put down roots. Yet from the very first day, an unsettling feeling tugged at him, hinting that all might not be as idyllic as it appeared. On his arrival day, moving boxes still cluttered the driveway as Malik began the process of settling into his dream home. It was then that he first noticed curious eyes peering from behind drawn curtains, watching him from darkened windows and secluded porches. Neighbors who passed by on their daily dog walks seemed to linger a moment too long, their glances betraying hidden intentions. No one approached him to extend a greeting, no friendly introductions were offered, and not even a simple welcome to the neighborhood was forthcoming. Only an awkward, pervasive silence. At first, Malik brushed off these observations, attributing them to the possibility that people in this community might simply be reserved and might warm up over time. However, the first unmistakable sign that things would not be as amicable as he hoped arrived the very next morning. Malik had barely finished brewing his coffee when a sharp knock resounded at his door. When he opened it, he was confronted by a woman in her mid-60s. She stood on his porch dressed in a neatly pressed beige blouse, her look accentuated by a pair of pearl earrings and a small pin displaying the HOA emblem affixed to her cardigan. Her posture was unnervingly rigid, and her expression carried an air of stern formality. Yet, it was her eyes that unsettled Malik the most. There was something inscrutable in their depths that he could not quite place. "Good morning," she said, her tone clipped and brisk. "I am Barbara Whitman, president of the Brentwood Estates Homeowners Association." Malik extended a hand in a courteous gesture, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you." Before he could finish his greeting, Barbara interrupted him abruptly, glancing past him as though her attention was directed to an unseen agenda inside his home. "I know who you are," she declared curtly. "I wanted to go over a few things." With that, she handed him a thick stack of printed documents, neatly stapled in the corner. They were the HOA guidelines. As Malik skimmed the pages, he noted that the rules were largely typical: standards for lawn maintenance, restrictions on exterior paint, guidelines for approved mailbox designs, the usual litany of community regulations. Yet, before he could settle his thoughts, Barbara cleared her throat and continued. "We like to maintain a certain standard here," she explained, her gaze shifting to the moving truck still parked in his driveway. "I assume you'll have that removed by this evening." Malik raised an eyebrow in mild surprise. "It'll be gone once I'm done unpacking," he replied evenly. Barbara merely nodded, though it was not the nod of satisfaction, but rather that of someone mentally ticking off a new item on her checklist. "Good," she said flatly. "And just so you're aware, the HOA requires that trash bins be placed at the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." "I didn't put them out," Malik responded calmly. "They must have been left that way by the previous owners." Barbara pursed her lips. "I see. Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away without another word. Malik closed the door and exhaled slowly. Perhaps she was merely a bit particular, a trait not uncommon among HOA presidents. He was determined not to let one overly strict neighbor tarnish his fresh start. But over the next few days, it became increasingly clear that Barbara was not just being particular, she was actively watching him. A warning notice appeared in his mailbox concerning an unauthorized vehicle in the driveway, ironically referring to his own car. A second notice arrived regarding improper lawn maintenance, citing that his grass had grown an inch or two beyond acceptable limits. Soon after, a formal HOA violation letter arrived, this one citing that his porch light was too bright, even though it was identical to the fixture the previous owner had used. By the end of the week, Malik had accumulated a neat stack of papers from Barbara. He had not spoken to her since that initial encounter, but her presence had been firmly established. Malik tried to remain calm, reasoning that perhaps she treated everyone with the same severity, or that he simply needed to adhere to the rules and she would eventually back off. Yet that hope evaporated quickly when one evening he took a leisurely walk and encountered a small group of neighbors engaged in quiet conversation near a driveway. The moment they saw him, their chatter ceased abruptly. One of the women managed only a tight smile before quickly returning to her conversation, and there, standing in the midst of them, was Barbara, arms crossed, whispering something to the others. Although Malik did not catch their words, he knew immediately that the issue was not merely about the HOA rules. It was about him personally. If Barbara believed that her tactics could intimidate him into leaving, she was gravely mistaken. Every morning thereafter, Malik found a new notice, neatly folded in his mailbox, each sealed with the Brentwood Estates HOA stamp. Initially, he simply tucked them away in a kitchen drawer, skimming their contents just enough to confirm what he already suspected. Barbara Whitman was resolutely determined to make his life miserable. By the time the fifth letter arrived, within just 2 weeks, Malik had had enough. This particular notice concerned his trash cans. It stated that bins must be retrieved from the curb within 1 hour of collection in order to preserve neighborhood aesthetics. Malik stared at the paper, irritation welling within him. He had retrieved his bins in the same manner as his neighbors did after work, yet apparently that was not sufficient. Curious to test the inconsistency of the rules, he decided on an experiment. The following morning, he rose early and embarked on a slow walk through the neighborhood, paying close attention to each house. By 9 a.m., he observed that dozens of trash bins remained lined up along the curbs. Some lids were not fully closed, others lay propped open with bags overflowing. Not a single violation notice had been affixed to any of those bins, except for his. Malik snapped several pictures and then sent an email to the HOA board, politely inquiring why his bins were being singled out while everyone else's were ignored. He received no response, but 2 days later, Barbara reappeared at his doorstep. This time she did not even knock. She simply stood there with arms crossed and a clipboard clutched in her hand. Malik opened the door and leaned against the frame. "Something I can help you with?" he asked. Barbara did not answer immediately. Instead, she peered over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the interior of his home as if she were taking inventory. Then she produced a form from her clipboard. "This is a formal request for you to submit proof of home ownership," she said in a voice that was both syrupy and sharp. "We have received complaints." He echoed. "Yes," Barbara continued, her tone growing more insistent. "Neighbors have expressed concerns. They've noticed unusual activity. Different cars coming and going, frequent furniture deliveries at odd hours. Some even suspect that you might be renting this property in violation of HOA regulations." Malik let out a short, humor-laced laugh. "You must be joking," he replied, his voice light but firm. Barbara's face did not betray even the slightest hint of surprise. Taking a deep breath, Malik forced himself to remain composed. "First of all, I own this house, and second, I have lived here for less than a month. I'm still in the process of moving in. That explains the deliveries, and as for the cars, they belong to friends and family who are visiting." Barbara pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around the clipboard as if to underscore her point. "We have policies in place to ensure that all homeowners are properly vetted. We will need to verify your deed," she stated, her tone devoid of any warmth. Malik was well aware of what this meant. He did not need to ask any other neighbors for proof of home ownership. He himself was the sole source. Keeping his voice even, he replied, "You can pull the records yourself. They are public information." Barbara's eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly recovered, smoothing out her expression. "I would prefer if you submitted it directly," she insisted. Malik tilted his head slightly and, with a faint curl of his lips that might have passed as a smile, said, "And if I don't?" Her lips twisted into what was meant to be a smile, but it lacked any genuine warmth. "Then I will have no choice but to escalate the matter with the HOA board," she threatened. Malik exhaled slowly, carefully restraining the retort that was bubbling at the tip of his tongue. He knew she wanted him to react, to raise his voice, to provide her with the excuse she needed to turn him into the problem. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "I'll think about it," before closing the door, leaving no further room for argument. Barbara clearly did not appreciate his calm dismissal. That evening, as Malik sat on his porch savoring a beer, he noticed her once again. She was standing at the end of his driveway, engaged in a hushed conversation with a man in a polo shirt and khakis. As he drew nearer, he saw her gesture toward his house and heard the man scribbling something down on a notepad. Although Malik could not hear every word, he did not need to. It was evident that Barbara was no longer merely intimidating him. She was actively plotting a strategy to force him out of his home. The following morning, Malik awoke to find an email from the HOA in his inbox. The subject line read, "Notice of violation." This particular email alleged that his porch furniture, a set consisting of 2 wicker chairs and a small glass table, failed to conform to the aesthetic standards outlined in the HOA guidelines. It was a vague rule, one that, upon Malik's careful observation, was clearly not being enforced for any of his neighbors, some of whom displayed far less tasteful or well-maintained outdoor seating. Leaning back in his chair, Malik exhaled slowly. He had strolled through the neighborhood enough times to be aware that at least a dozen other homes featured similar setups. Some even had old plastic chairs that had clearly been left out for years, yet somehow only his arrangement was considered problematic. Malik decided to ignore the notice. However, a day later, another email arrived, this one titled, "Second Notice, Lawn Maintenance Violation." Malik frowned, knowing that his lawn had been freshly cut, edged, and watered. He had devoted the entire afternoon to trimming the hedges and ensuring that everything was in pristine condition, yet the formal complaint claimed that his grass was slightly overgrown and warned of impending fines if the issue was not rectified. At that moment, Malik recognized exactly what was happening. Barbara was attempting to drown him in a deluge of complaints, minor infractions that, when taken together, would provide her with the leverage needed to escalate the situation further. Determined to counter her tactics, he decided to play her game. That evening, he took a slow, deliberate walk through the neighborhood, meticulously jotting down every single violation he could observe. Overgrown yards, broken shutters, faded house numbers, trash bins left out by the curb well past the prescribed time. Then, one by one, he submitted his own complaints, each carefully backed with time-stamped photographs. It took less than 24 hours for Barbara to reappear at his doorstep. This time, however, she was not alone. Standing beside her was another member of the HOA board, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a clipboard in hand. Malik recognized him from the HOA website as Stephen Reynolds, the vice president. Barbara's expression was even tenser than usual, her forced politeness barely concealing her irritation as she greeted him. "Mr. Patterson," she said in a stretched, thin voice, "we have received your list of complaints." Malik crossed his arms and nodded slowly. "Good. Then you know I'm not the only one being held to an absurd standard," he replied, his tone calm yet assertive. Stephen cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Barbara before speaking. "We appreciate your concerns, but the HOA board is the one that determines which issues warrant formal action. Not every minor infraction justifies a violation notice." "Mine do, but everyone else's do not," Malik countered, his tone laced with quiet determination. Barbara did not respond immediately. Instead, she produced a printed form from her clipboard and handed it to him. "This is your final warning before fines are imposed. Your porch furniture must be replaced, and your lawn must remain at the regulated length at all times." Malik stared at the paper and then slowly looked up at Barbara. He was not naive. This was not really about the furniture or the lawn. It was about making him feel as though he did not belong. Taking a deep breath and forcing a measured smile, he said, "You know, Barbara, I have read through the HOA bylaws from cover to cover, and nowhere does it state that a homeowner must replace furniture that is in perfect condition." Barbara stiffened visibly. "It's a matter of neighborhood uniformity," she replied, her tone brittle. Malik raised an eyebrow. "So you are enforcing rules that do not exist?" he asked, his voice calm but challenging. At that moment, Stephen shifted uncomfortably for the first time, doubt flickering in his eyes. Malik decided to press further. "Let me ask you something," he said evenly. "If I were someone else, say one of my neighbors, would we even be having this conversation?" Barbara's nostrils flared in indignation and Stephen began to open his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. "No answer," Malik said, folding the paper in half. That's what I thought. Barbara inhaled sharply and forced a tight-lipped smile. If you refuse to comply, the HOA has the authority to take further action. Malik met her gaze unwaveringly. Then do what you have to do, she snapped, turning on her heel and walking away with a posture that barely concealed her mounting frustration. Stephen lingered for a moment before following her, leaving Malik gripping the violation notice in his hand. He had, in effect, just called her bluff. But Barbara was not the type to relent easily. Malik braced himself for further retaliation, though he had not anticipated just how far she would go. The next morning, a thick envelope appeared in his mailbox. This time it bore no HOA logo. Instead, it originated from a law firm. Inside was an official complaint, filed with the Davidson County Housing Authority, accusing Malik of being a fraudulent occupant. Barbara had escalated the matter from petty fines to an outright attempt to have him legally removed from his own home. Malik stared at the document, his pulse steady even as his hands clenched around the paper. She is really doing this, he thought as he carefully read through the complaint. The allegations were flimsy at best, claims that he had failed to provide proof of home ownership, suspicions that he was renting the property under false pretenses, and a statement that multiple neighbors had expressed vague concerns about his presence. No names were mentioned, no concrete evidence was offered, only assumptions cloaked in legal jargon. For a moment Malik considered ignoring the accusations, confident that they would not hold up. But then he realized that this was not about evicting him as much as it was about exhausting him, about trying to wear him down with endless legal headaches. Barbara's intent was clear. She wanted him frustrated, drained, and willing to simply walk away rather than fight back. What she did not know, however, was that she was playing right into his hands. Later that evening, Malik made a phone call. "Hey, Joe," he said when the line picked up. "I need a favor." Joe Martinez had long been Malik's real estate attorney, sharp, relentless, and in many ways twice as ruthless as Barbara had ever hoped to be. By the next morning, Malik had everything he needed. He was not merely going to defend himself, he was prepared to turn the entire situation on its head. 3 days later, an emergency HOA board meeting was convened, and the room was packed with homeowners. Barbara sat at the head of the long conference table, her expression carefully neutral. The other board members flanked her. Some looked uncomfortably uneasy, while others pretended to be absorbed in their notes. The atmosphere buzzed with whispered conversations as homeowners shifted in their seats, their eyes alternating between Malik and the board. Everyone had heard the rumors, and everyone was waiting for a showdown. Barbara cleared her throat and lifted a printed document. "We are here to address the ongoing issue regarding Mr. Patterson's residence," she announced. Given the numerous violations and the concerns raised by our community members, before she could continue, Malik interrupted, his voice calm yet firm. "I'm speaking now," a murmur spread through the room. Barbara stiffened, but he continued regardless. "Here is the deed to my house, legal proof that I own this home, filed, recorded, and indisputable." A few heads turned, and some board members exchanged glances as Malik set the deed down and produced another document. "This is the purchase agreement for the property at 2 and 14 Oakwood Drive," he said. Barbara's face remained impassive, though Malik detected a fleeting hint of confusion in her eyes. Then he produced a final document, pausing dramatically before stating, "And this," he declared, "is the deed for 2 and 16 Oakwood Drive. Barbara, that is your house." A heavy silence fell over the room. Malik did not sit back down immediately. Instead, he allowed the weight of the moment to settle, giving Barbara time to process what had just transpired. The same woman who had spent weeks trying to have him removed was now confronted with the fact that her very own house belonged to him, a fact she had been completely unaware of. Barbara's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Finally, in a quiet, tight voice, she asked, "How?" Malik folded his arms and replied, "Perhaps you should check the HOA records, Barbara. That foreclosure you ignored, the property sale that went through last month, I was the buyer." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Barbara's hands clenched around the papers in front of her. Malik tilted his head and calmly asked, "So, tell me, Barbara, who is the real trespasser here?" With that single question, the entire room shifted. The stunned silence was palpable. Barbara's face drained of color as her meticulously controlled demeanor began to crack at the edges. The power she had wielded over Malik for weeks disintegrated before everyone's eyes. Malik allowed a long pause to underscore the significance of his words, knowing she needed time to absorb the revelation. Not willing to let the moment pass, Malik picked up another document from his neatly stacked pile. "Now," he said, "let's talk about fraudulent eviction attempts." Barbara's head snapped up in alarm. "Excuse me?" Malik tapped the legal complaint that Barbara had filed against him. "You reported me as an illegal occupant. You claimed I had no right to live in my own home. Would you care to explain why?" Barbara's fingers twitched against the table, but she forced her voice to remain even as Malik continued. "In my report, I mentioned that several residents had expressed concerns. Yet, I personally spoke with many neighbors before this meeting, and not one of them recalls expressing any such concerns." A few murmurs arose in the room as homeowners exchanged uneasy glances. The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just between Malik and Barbara. It was now clear to everyone that Barbara had been selectively enforcing rules against him while ignoring similar violations in the rest of the community. Barbara opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Malik continued. "You have accused me of violating HOA policies, yet time and time again you have turned a blind eye to the very infractions I have reported." He then produced a stack of printed emails. "These emails document the formal complaints I filed about broken shutters, overgrown lawns, trash bins left out for days, all of which, by your own admission, never resulted in any violation notices, except for mine." Turning to the rest of the board, Malik asked pointedly, "Do these rules only apply when you, Barbara, feel like enforcing them?" Stephen Reynolds, the vice president, cleared his throat and said, "I think we should take a moment to—" Malik interrupted sharply, his eyes still fixed on Barbara. "Because this isn't really about HOA rules at all. It was never about that. It was about you deciding who belongs here and who does not." A sharp murmur rippled through the crowd. For the first time, panic flashed across Barbara's face. Malik was not only exposing her abuse of power, he was forcing the entire neighborhood to see what had been happening all along. Barbara let out a shaky breath. "Mr. Patterson, I was simply trying to intimidate you into leaving," she admitted haltingly. "Yeah, I got that," Malik replied coolly. Silence followed for a moment until an older man at the back of the room broke through the stillness. "This is a disgrace," he muttered. Malik recognized the man as Mr. Holloway, one of the longest-standing residents in the neighborhood. Mr. Holloway shook his head slowly and addressed Barbara directly. "You really tried to evict the man who owns your house?" A few scattered chuckles echoed through the room as the tide began to turn. Still not finished, Malik placed his final document on the table. "And one more thing, Barbara," he said firmly. "You are behind on your HOA fees." Her head snapped up in shock. "That's a lie," Malik countered, tapping the paper for emphasis. "I bought your house at auction, remember that? And that purchase included the debt attached to it. In fact, you owe the HOA over $3,000 in unpaid fines and fees." A fresh wave of whispers swept through the board members. Stephen adjusted his glasses, frowning as he reviewed the document. "Barbara, is this true?" he asked cautiously. Barbara's lips parted, but no words came out. It was clear that she had buried herself under the weight of her own misdeeds. Malik leaned back in his chair and said, "I suggest you start paying up. Wouldn't want to violate any of your own rules, would you?" A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. Even some board members could barely contain their amusement. Barbara's face burned a deep red as she realized that her weeks of trying to control Malik had now reduced her authority to nothing. Finally, Barbara snapped, "This meeting is adjourned. We will revisit this matter at a later date." She shot to her feet, shoving her papers into a folder, and marched toward the exit. Her heels clicked sharply against the tiled floor, and for the first time that night no one followed her. Malik exhaled deeply, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He had won this round, yet he knew that Barbara was not the type to simply walk away without launching another fight. The following morning, Malik spotted Barbara once more, this time standing at the edge of his driveway. She was not alone. Her husband Richard, a man in his early 70s with a stiff posture and a perpetual scowl, stood beside her. Malik stepped onto his porch with his arms folded. "Something I can help you with?" he inquired coolly. Barbara's voice was tight and controlled as she replied, "I want to discuss the sale of my home." Malik had expected this confrontation. After all, the thought of renting from him must have become unbearable for her. "I'm not selling," he stated simply. Barbara's jaw clenched in frustration. "I've lived in that house for 32 years, she insisted. Malik tilted his head slightly. "Yet you never paid off the debt attached to it," he countered. Richard cleared his throat before adding, "We're prepared to offer you a fair price." Leaning against the railing, Malik asked, "Define fair." Barbara huffed, her patience visibly wearing thin. "The same amount you paid at auction," she retorted. Malik let out a short laugh. "That's not how real estate works," he said. "You lost your house because of unpaid fees. I legally purchased it. If you want it back, you'll have to buy it at market value." Barbara's hands balled into fists. "That's ridiculous. You're just trying to make a profit off of me," she accused. Malik's expression hardened. "No, Barbara. I'm treating you exactly how you treated me," he replied evenly. A heavy silence stretched between them for several long minutes. Barbara had weaponized rules and regulations against him for weeks, convinced that she held all the power. Now, however, she was the one at someone else's mercy. Richard sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face, and in a tone laden with resignation, he asked, "How much are we talking?" Malik glanced toward the house, considering its prime location, the current market conditions, and the unpaid fees. $450,000, he declared. Barbara's face twisted in disbelief. "That's outrageous," she whispered. Malik shrugged. "Then I guess you'll have to find somewhere else to live." For the first time, genuine panic flickered across her face. This was no longer an abstract threat, but a stark reality. She was not merely being removed from the HOA board. She was on the verge of losing the home in which she had lived for 3 decades. Richard sighed again, heavily, and rubbed his face as though trying to erase the bitter truth. "We'll consider it," he murmured. Malik nodded, his tone measured. "Take your time." As they turned to leave, Barbara hesitated for a moment and looked back at him. In her eyes, Malik detected something different. A glimmer, not of remorse, but of the realization that she had never truly been in control. For weeks, she had been so focused on pushing him out that she had failed to see the real danger her own actions had created. After a long pause, Malik spoke once more. "Barbara," he said quietly, "next time you judge someone before truly knowing them, remember where it got you." He gestured subtly toward her house, his voice carrying both a warning and a note of finality. Barbara said nothing in response. She simply turned and walked away. About a month later, a for sale sign appeared in front of 216 Oakwood Drive. Barbara had refused to buy back the house at the price Malik had set, and no bank would grant her the necessary loan for the amount she required. In the dead of night, she and Richard packed up their belongings and left for a smaller residence across town.